Yeah, great point. Yeah, the Sicarii we talked about, the dagger men, are actually going to assassinate Ananias, and maybe that, and some think maybe Paul. Yeah, well, I don't know. I shouldn't say that. I don't think Paul knows uh, the outcome of Ananias, but he may know his character. As Greg mentioned, he may have heard of his character from being gone, even though he doesn't recognize him. So yeah, great comments, a lot of good thought there. So that's the kind of person we're dealing with here. And Greg's mentioned well the corruption and the power. Ananias really was all about that. And as Alex mentions, and when he's killed is from zealots. They kill him because of his sympathizing with Rome. And so they're going to put him to death before the real Jewish revolt gets up to a heated point to where the war really breaks out against Rome and the Jews. So interesting thought. So we kind of have an idea now why he may not have recognized him. Any other thoughts? Someone wrote, one commentator I read wrote, Paul's basically saying, I did not think a man who behaved so illegally as to order him to be struck could possibly be a high priest. Comes back to the character issue that Greg mentioned. So several things are in mind there as far as why he may not have recognized him. I wanted to deal with this because here's what Paul's alluding to. You've broken the law, Deuteronomy 25, 1 through 2. If there's a dispute between men and they go to court and the judges decide their case, and they justify the righteous and condemn the wicked, then it shall be, if the wicked man deserves to be beaten, the judge shall then make him lie down and be beaten in his presence with a number of stripes according to his guilt. So Paul knew the law and he respected the law. And he throws that out to them. He knows this, that someone's not punished until the judge decides the case. And this was very highly thought of by the Jews. It was to show righteous judgment as they tried to do in their courts. And we know that was a sham. In the case of Jesus, we see it in a sham because of the high priests and their corruption. Yes, sir, Ed.
Whatever, knowing that he's a Roman citizen.
Well, that's a great point you raise. And that's why he's basically doing it to find out what are the charges against this man. So, and that's a great point you make, Ed, because that's why the commander is going to pull Paul out again. We're fixing to see the commander is going to get Paul away from this group again. And I think the very point is because he's a Roman citizen. He's not just going to let just anything happen to him unless he can determine what has he done? What's he guilty of? No. He wants to know what's he guilty of, and then we'll determine what his punishment, whether he lets the Sanhedrin punish him, which they had the rights to punish for punishment to some degree, or if it was something that Romans needed to deal with. But you're right. I think because he's a Roman citizen, we're going to see the commander step in again and bring him out of there, because we talked about what the responsibility was for this commander. If something happens to a Roman citizen, we talked about the severity of that, didn't we? So there's a great point you raised. And that's something to keep in mind, how we see this commander react to the Sanhedrin's reaction. The commander's going to react. And I think it's very much like Ed says, because Paul's a Roman citizen. So great point. Here's something I want to ask you about. Let's see. Okay, I think that's good. Any other thoughts or comments? We look at the rest of the passage here, verses 6 through 8. But perceiving that one group, Paul's perceiving this group, he's looked at them intently, and there's a lot of discussion about what that means, but he sees the group that's in front of him. And no doubt, Paul, there's probably some still on the Sanhedrin, because you're kind of on Sanhedrin for pretty much life when you were appointed during that day and time. I believe that's correct. Now, that's where our Supreme Court works, but they're pretty much that way. They could be on that Sanhedrin for many years when they were appointed. And so there's no doubt some on there that Paul probably recognized. And so, but Paul, perceiving that one group were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, Paul began crying out in the council. Now he's having to cry out because the idea is this is kind of getting, because of these things Paul has said, they've got stirred up again. And it's kind of probably a loud commotion going on within this body. And Paul cries out in the middle of all this commotion, and cries out in the council, "Brethren, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees, and I'm on trial for the hope and resurrection of the dead. Now, Paul gets to the crux of the matter, and that's why he's been arrested. That's why they've hated him from the very beginning, is that he spoke about Jesus Christ being raised from the dead. And so that's the essence of really why this hatred for Paul has begun, and that they've embraced the Gentiles into this belief as well. So that he gets to the gist of it here. And as he said this, there occurred a dissension between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the assembly divided. For the Sadducees say there is no resurrection, nor an angel, nor a spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. So what occurs here when Paul throws up that fact that he's a Pharisee and that he's on trial, but he's been accused, he's on trial for the hope and resurrection of the dead. He doesn't mention Jesus in that, just the fact that there's hope and there's resurrection. So what happens to the crowd there, to the Sanhedrin? They get real upset. Half of them do. The other half do what? He's what, Mike? He split the vote, didn't he? And you know, in the Sanhedrin, you pretty much had to have a unanimous vote, especially for capital punishment. It had to be unanimous. And Paul's just split them, hadn't he? Because now what they're focused on is their differences. Now, ask this question. I was going to ask this question. It's not coming up. Ryan, can you hit that? Froze up on me. Did Paul know how explosive his words would be? Yeah, there you go. Thank you.
I think he did.
Think he did?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think? Everybody in agreement? He probably knew there was going to be some confrontation, huh, Jim? What'd you say?
I think it.
And exactly. And you think about it, if this group is getting contentious, Paul's worried about this is going bad fast, isn't it? I mean, because they're all out to get him. And they've already called for his death. You know, the mob had called for his death. And so when he throws this out there, it changes the whole scenario, doesn't it? Because now they start to battle among themselves. And there occurred a great uproar, verses 9 and 10. And there occurred a great uproar. And some of the scribes of the Pharisaic party stood up and began to argue heatedly. Listen to this change. Began to argue heatedly. We found nothing wrong with this man. Suppose a spirit or an angel has spoken to him. Now, see, some of them had heard some of his speech to the mob where he talked about what had happened to him, that he's on the road to Damascus. Remember, Paul's just recounted this to the mob. He's talked about being on the road to Damascus, and Jesus speaks to him. And so it's interesting they refer back to this. Maybe that's the thing that puts this point in their head, that, well, maybe we find nothing wrong with this man. Suppose a spirit or an angel has spoken to them, which the Pharisees believe in, but the Sadducees don't. And as a great dissension was developing, here we come to your point, Ed. As a great dissension was developing, the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them, and he'd ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. Okay? So what do you picture has happened here? Well, Paul's been rescued again, hadn't he? It was fixing to get out of hand. And I think that point you raised, Ed, is a very valid point. The commander, knowing that he's a Roman citizen, he's worried he's about to be torn into pieces. He's about to lose control. They're going to take this man who's a Roman citizen. Who knows what they're going to do to him? Whoops, sorry, I didn't flip my screen. That he was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. So he sends his troops back in, and he brings Paul back out. He didn't get to the bottom of it, did he? He still does not know what is this man accused of. Now, Paul's brought it up, but the commander doesn't know, and is a Roman citizen, so he's concerned for his safety. So he brings him back to the Fortress Antonio and puts Paul back in his cell.
The commander was wondering how Paul got the.
Yeah, we looked at that last week. Yeah, if you look there at the end of chapter 22, yeah, he's wondering how he got to be a Roman citizen. So he knows he is, and that's why he reacts that way. So quite a change scenario. But what do you think this mindset, how do you think Paul's mindset might be? We're going to see a little bit of that in this next passage. Alex?
Nothing about that's how Temple even came up. They just started going after it for other reasons. So it shows that they were making that crap up to begin with just to try to get him into their hands and handle it.
Yeah, they had no witnesses to prove that. Exactly. So it was just whatever they could do to get him. And then we see how bitter the two groups are, the Pharisees and Sadducees, how bitter they are towards one another, that they they lose sight of what they're there for, and they just began to battle each other. So yeah, we see political challenges. Yes, sir, ma'am. Makes you wonder how they could rule together in the Sanhedrin, doesn't it? Yeah. Well, this is a very emotional issue. The resurrection of the dead, which the Pharisees believed in, and spirits, and Sadducees didn't. If you got into those issues, Nancy, they didn't come together very well. If you'd stay off of that, I guess they kind of got things done. But yeah, great point. But Paul you got to think that Paul's got to really be discouraged. Because where's Paul wanting to try to get to? Rome. He's wanting to get to Rome, and now he's in prison. He's had an opportunity to speak to his brethren, the Jews, and they won't listen to him. And it's just getting worse for Paul, it seems like. It's like, am I ever going to get out of here? Where's this going to go? And you can imagine as he's sitting in his cell, and it says in the next passage, really interesting passage, but on the night immediately following, the Lord stood at his side and said, "Take courage, for as you have solemnly witnessed to my cause at Jerusalem, so you must witness at Rome also." Jesus is basically he comes to Paul to comfort him. And whatever, we don't know the vision, how Jesus stood by his side, but he's telling Paul, you will go to Rome. You will go to Rome. And listen to what Paul tells Timothy in 2 Timothy 4, verse 16 and 17. One of the last of Paul's writings, as he writes to young Timothy, "At my first defense, no one supported me, but all deserted me. May it not be counted against them. But the Lord stood with me and strengthened me, so that through me the proclamation might be fully accomplished, and that all the Gentiles might hear, and I was rescued out of the lion's mouth." Owen? Caught in between?
Yeah. They lost.
Yeah, Paul definitely.
He says, I don't remember where the verse is, but he talks between God.
Yeah. Well, I know Paul, he definitely had his focus on the right thing, didn't he? His focus was on God and doing God's word. And we've talked about the corruption of these other leaders. That's not what we're focused on. And Paul says in Philippians 1, I'm in a strait betwixt two, having a desire to depart and to be with Christ. But to be here is far better for you. To be with Christ is far better. So Paul wasn't afraid to die, but he knew there was work for him to do. And no doubt he's discouraged with his brethren didn't accept him, but Jesus comforts him. And he refers probably, as he mentions to Timothy, and some have written that Paul was probably discouraged, he was disappointed, and doubtful that he'd ever get to Rome, maybe doubtful that he'd ever leave Jerusalem. And we're going to see next week in our text, Ed, the commander, is actually going to get Paul out of Jerusalem because of threats against Paul. And Ananias and his hatred, the high priest's hatred is so animate towards Paul that he's going to follow him and try to get him condemned. So we see the animosity there that Paul, no doubt, was needed this encouragement. Well, that's 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 probably a good point too, Greg, isn't it? Much less all the things he taught, but yeah, he's just kind of called me out, didn't he? Yeah, he maybe embarrassed the high priest a little bit, didn't he? You don't speak that way to the high priest, and he did that. And I'm, and if he's as corrupt a leader as we read about in Josephus, yeah, that probably wasn't something he wanted to let go, was it? Great point. Good, really good point. Other thoughts or comments? But Paul's received encouragement from Christ before. He was told in Acts 9 that Jesus would appear to him on other occasions, which he does. And we've seen it before. But that's where his encouragement came from. Beginning with chapter 16 of Acts, the central theme is Paul's progress towards going to Rome. And we talked about that. This is what we're headed towards. The rest of this book, even starting with chapter 16, is part of the journey of how Paul is going to get to Rome. And we'll see that continue to unfold in the rest of this book. So we're going to stop there this morning. Any final thoughts or comments? We'll leave Paul in his cell at this point in the text, and then we'll pick up next week, or reading next week, if you're following along in the Truth for Today commentary, are pages 350 to 366. And we're going to see Paul is going to have to be moved out of Jerusalem to protect him, and continuing protection. The Roman commander is going to be a part of that. So if you'll follow along, but appreciate your good comments and all this morning. So we'll end there.